From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. Today we're ushering in the new year with a friend of the show, Beekeeper Melanie Kirby, and we'll be talking to her right after this announcement. Okay, here's something super cool. Join us for a yoga class series designed specifically for ranchers and farmers, taught by Montana-based Alexis Bonagovsky, yogi and rancher. She has created this class series, a combination of yoga poses and strength and mobility exercises to meet the specific needs of farmers and ranchers. Classes are free and will be live streamed on Quivira's YouTube channel every Sunday at 10 a.m. Mountain Time from now through February 11th. And now to our show. I'm so happy to welcome back to the show Melanie Kirby. She's a beekeeper who provides multiple services, including queen bee breeding, pollination services, and honey. She's a scientist, she's a member of Tortugas Pueblo, and she's extension educator for the land grant program at the Institute of American Indian Arts here in Santa Fe. Welcome.
Hi, Mary Charlotte. So glad to be here.
It's nice to have you. You were here a few years ago when you were talking about the program at IAIA, and you were also recently at the Regenerate conference. You are a beekeeper, and we're here talking about regenerative agriculture, and bees are very much part of all agriculture because they pollinate, and pollination is part of virtually everything that we eat. Tell us a little bit about how it works for you, keeping in mind an ecosystem approach. How do you actually keep bees? I mean, you call yourself a landless farmer, and yet your hives need to be on land. So what does that look like?
Yeah, by circumstance mostly, I have not owned land. And I think that has, from the very beginning, set me on a path of becoming a more engaged community member that's working in tandem with farmers and gardeners to not only grow food for our local food systems, but to also support pollinators. And so without having my own land, I've been forging relationships with different land stewards for decades now who have been very gracious and willing to share space for bees. And part of that has been either just extra space that they had that they were willing to have bees on, or they've been focused growers who need pollination services. And so I can bring bees in to provide that service for them.
So when somebody needs pollination services, like what kind of farmer are you talking about? Like fruit trees, like other things?
Yeah, sometimes it's for fruit trees. Other times it's for particular crops, everything from herbs to nuts to vegetables.
And they all need bees.
There's a lot of different pollinator species. So, of course, there's butterflies, bats, birds, of course, ants, and even flies and wasps that can do this. But honeybees in particular are quite manageable and can be moved en masse to these different, what we call pollination events. And so that's made it possible for them to become this go-to pollinator species, though there's a myriad of pollinator species.
So when you say a farmer might let you set up your beehives on their land if they have space, do beehives take up a lot of space?
Not necessarily, but I mean, if you consider, there's a bee itself, and each one of those bees is like a cell in this larger body. The hive is a superorganism. But if you were to sort of look at it as each one of these hive superorganisms is similar to one cow, right? And so while they don't need a lot of space in terms of area in which they're going to be housed, they do need space to forage. And so, of course, their foraging is in flying through the airspace versus ground space. But for a hive itself, we can normally fit about 4 different hive families on a regular size pallet. It doesn't take that much physical space for them, but it definitely takes airspace.
I mean, it seems like a mutually beneficial relationship. The farmers need bees and bees need that land. And yet I find myself wondering, is there something kind of wrong on an ecosystem level if they need to import bees. I mean, pollination is a service that you provide, and there's a lot of beekeepers who are using that as an income stream, and that's great for the beekeepers. But what does it say about our land when there aren't enough pollinators that you literally have to bring them in on a pallet?
That's a really good question. I mean, it is really indicative of sort of the larger conundrums of our stewardship on the earth. You know, there's been imbalances made, right? So when we get these large-scale monocrop systems that are now turning a particular landscape into sort of a singular bloom, they're all blooming at the same time. There's not enough pollinators within that space to effectively pollinate all of that. So yeah, there's an imbalance, and then additional pollinators are brought in. Yeah, that's at the sort of fundamental crux of the conundrum of what our stewardship is, and how we try to maximize space. Maximize space meaning extract as much as possible out of it, right? Within a given space. And so we have these efforts to try to regenerate landscapes, to be more integrative in their approaches, to use holistic management practices in order to have biodiversity preserved and even promoted within these spaces. Rotational grazing really supports that because, I mean, we see it with the historical aspects of the bison that roamed across the landscape. They didn't stay in just one paddock. They moved through. They actually helped to condition the land. They helped to actually move seeds and break seeds, and also to aerate the landscape. And so all of these different things came together in order for there to be this wonderful forage that now feeds pollinators and also larger animals.
So you're talking about a kind of Great Plains ecosystem with
as an
example, with bison moving across it, which we talk about a lot on this show, which rotational grazing is kind of trying to mimic. And on that landscape a few thousand years ago, nobody was bringing in pollinators. They were there.
They were there. And that's also, too, because the landscape was diversified. You know, you had a myriad of different kinds of flowers. And when you have a myriad of different kinds, they may not all be blooming at the same time. And so you can have varying pollinator species that can feast on that and to help support that plant cycle of reproduction. You know, I consider pollinators to be kind of like the doulas or the midwives that are helping these plants to bear fruit later, you know, and helping through that process of sexual reproduction. I mean, they're literally moving sperm or pollen over to ovaries and eggs. And so yeah, the idea that we can mimic that, to bring that back, to regenerate some of these landscapes. So even in areas where there were not buffalo, there was another movement that was happening through those landscapes. And this would depend whether it's coastal or wooded or forest or what have you, you know, that was allowing all these different processes to happen. Plants and pollinators, they follow each other. So, you know, historically speaking, I mean, you had gymnosperms, which didn't require pollination. Those are like huge ferns, right?
Okay.
And then you have angiosperms, which are flowering
plants. Are we talking about
plants.
the history of evolution here?
Yeah, a little bit. You know, but then you have angiosperms develop. So these are flowering plants, and they developed along with pollinator species, and that type of relationship has been around, of course, for eons. But within that comes this not only larger choreography, but I call it sort of this conversation, this broadcast and reception that happens between the plants and the pollinators. And then you add in our stewardship. So now we're back to present times, right? We know we have flowering plants, but what we choose to grow and in the ways in which we grow it are going to affect that relationship between the pollinators and the plants.
So when you have monocrops, whether it be fruit trees or nut trees or vast fields of corn or whatever, it's so unnatural that if you just kind of leave it up to pollinators to show up, they're not going to show up by themselves because they don't have a diverse food source all year round.
Right. I mean, to a certain degree, that aspect of moving livestock, whether it's winged or hooved, two-legged, four-legged, or six-legged for insects, we're manipulating the landscape. And so, yeah, there's just, at the core of all of it is just this real major imbalance. So when we look at now and these, you know, the ranching efforts of those who are able to have space and they're able to move their livestock within that, in a sense, we are trying to kind of recreate and go back to this notion of shared space between species.
Talk a little more about the relationship between bees and cattle. Like, how do they influence each other's lives?
That's a really good question. You know, we may not think this right at the bat, but bees being responsible for a lot of the food that we eat, you know, that also includes milk, right? So if cows don't have alfalfa or goats don't have their forage, they're not going to be able to produce that milk. And so pollinators are needed.
When you envision, I mean, you're deeply involved in stewardship and in telling stories that help people think about stewardship. When you envision a better farm system, from your perspective as a beekeeper, what would that look like? I mean, we talk about farming that integrates both crop production and livestock. We talk about smaller operations with less monocropping and more cover crops. How do you envision a really healthy farm system where pollinators are concerned?
You know, I think at this point, if I were to have my own land, I would do what I could to nurture what was needed to provide for that space. But as one who also seeks to not just be a subsistence farmer, to actually create a livelihood and to be able to afford the varying things that our modern world, you know, kind of at this point demands of us to a certain degree, you know, but the ability, like cars, like cell phones, like internet, like, you know, running water, things like that. We all now live in this world that we have fabricated that requires money. And with that comes then, okay, in what ways can we generate income? And I think those that are able to also generate income by doing a land-based endeavor that is supportive of healthy ecosystems, I think that that's something that we can all entertain and we can learn from each other in what ways to do it. So for myself, that really entails being able to have access to not only nutritional landscapes, but it's always an act of reciprocity, right? So if I can have access, then what can I provide in return? Well, I can share my bees with this landscape, with these other stewards, in order to help nurture this landscape. And so I see it not so much as like, well, it's completely out of balance and I'm bringing something in order to like shift that balance. It's more along the lines of how can we in community share space? And so I see it as it's not so much that I want to own lots of land in different places so that I have places to take my bees to, but more so how can I share with other people and they share with me in order for us to provide for each other's livelihoods so that we're each able to live as healthy as we can given our circumstances and to be able to support each other. And I think that that's, you know, if people want to have a good crop or they want to have good pasture, their other livestock can forage on, they're going to want to have healthy plant growth. And in order to have that healthy plant growth, you know, it all starts with a seed. And those pollinators are helping to make those seeds.
Yeah, I mean, you've been doing this a long time and you've developed relationships with the agrarians where your bees live, at least part of the year or whatever. What are those relationships like? Are you learning from each other all the time? Like, are you sharing things that you know about stewardship?
Most definitely. And I have to say that those relationships have been instrumental in me evolving not only my immediate skill set, but in the ways in which I want to be of service to my communities, working with different farmers, understanding a little bit more of their circumstances, recognizing what some of their plights are, what some of their challenges are, some that run parallel to my own or are quite distinct from my own.
What are some examples of that?
Some examples of that would include, you know, of course, having access to water, being able to keep the traditions of acequia stewardship alive as well, you know, or their challenges in being able to effectively manage, even including succession plans.
Succession from one generation to the next.
Right. There's sometimes even things that affect what they can and can't do. And a lot of that is also rooted in sociopolitical circumstances as well, accessibility or infrastructure or having that technical support that they need. I've really come to find that a lot of that resonates. So much so that it's what encouraged me to go back to school and get a master's and to work now also in extension education, and also now to becoming more intrigued and motivated to help work in policy and working to support our working lands and environmental stewardship.
What kind of policy changes are you talking about, thinking about, and promoting?
So one of the sort of projects I've been really trying to support and to keep the momentum going with, that is to establish a pollinator protection plan for the state of New Mexico. So in 2014, which was basically 10 years ago, the Obama administration put out a presidential memorandum encouraging all states to develop their own pollinator protection plan. And so 10 years later, not every state has one, including New Mexico. We do not have one.
Do some have them as a result of that initiative?
Yeah, Washington State has a wonderful one. I know Michigan does as well, New York. A lot of different states haven't, but not every single state. And it would, one, not only be embarrassing, but really sad if New Mexico was one of the last ones to get it done.
I hate being 50th.
I know, right? Right, pretty much. And so, yeah, the idea is, how can we work in community to raise awareness? These other state pollinator plans have different aspects to their plans, which I think is why the federal government was encouraging each state to develop their own, because they knew that each state had different circumstances.
So what would New Mexico, what would a good pollinator protection plan in New Mexico look like?
Well, I can tell you from my own sort of larger vision is I would really like to see an effort to not only raise awareness about pollinators. On the one hand, we do have a lot of agriculture here in New Mexico. We're not, one of the highest producing agricultural states in the nation, but we do grow food here. And I think that our approach to it is already very climate smart and adaptive. I think that we can really showcase our state as leaders in pollinator protection in terms of raising awareness of not only the importance, but how communities can become involved to help support pollinator health. And in supporting pollinator health, they're supporting biodiversity. They're supporting healthy landscapes for the next generation, whether it's urban or rural or wild lands.
That's something that everybody that I talk to about food, they always want to know, well, what can I do? So when you talk about communities getting involved in pollinator protection, what can communities do?
Yeah, it all starts with planting seeds. And so finding plants that are either native plants or that are adapted specifically to our area that can be grown, without a lot of inputs, but everybody needs water. So, you got to be able to help also make sure that whatever you plant has the ability to grow. And that also connects straight up with soil health. It starts from the ground up.
Are you talking about farmers specifically or also gardeners, or what are you talking about?
I think everyone from, youth to elders, and especially farmers, gardeners, even those living in urban settings, they can have container gardens. It could be on a balcony, it could be on a stoop.
And that makes a difference?
Oh, it totally does. Schools, municipalities, churches. If we all focused on what we can grow and what we can try and grow in healthy ways, we're providing not only aesthetic beauty to our landscapes, which is nice, but we're also providing for those above and beyond ourselves, meaning these other species that help to keep us alive. So I think the potential for a pollinator protection plan for our state, while it would initially focus on raising awareness, from there it could grow to actually include policies or bills or actual movements that can help to support pollinator conservation, habitat restoration, and also conservation efforts across the state. Conservation of farmland, but also conservation of wild landscapes.
When we talk about things like pesticides, obviously pesticides are not good for bees. Bees aren't pests, but they get killed just like any other quote-unquote pest animal by those chemicals. But it's complicated because, there are even some organic chemicals that are allowed to be used on organic farms that aren't good for bees.
Yeah, we have to be really careful about what we apply on any landscape. anything that has a lingering effect and or residues or that can build up over time. And there's a lot of information that we just don't know. I think a lot of our sort of larger scale society practices don't have a lot of future thought. They're very short-sighted. We're looking at immediate gains or immediate control or whatever needs to be done in that moment to put out a fire, right?
Right.
It's not necessarily proactive and forward thinking. And when we look at
just like the rest of our own lives, right?
Exactly, right. And immediate gratification too. Like we think, oh, this will get rid of this issue or this pest right here in this moment. But we may not realize that, it's leaching into the soil. And now that's going to affect a myriad of organisms that reside there, or that then the plant will take up, and then it's becomes systemic, and it's in their pollens and their nectars, and everything that comes into contact with it would be exposed. I think, pesticides have a role to play, whether they're synthetic or naturally derived. But unfortunately, there's been situations in a few places, but one that's really gotten some attention has been in Nebraska, where a bee researcher, Dr. Judy Woo-Smart, she's a wonderful researcher. She had noticed that the bees that they were using for research for her and her students around their campus were not doing very well, and she couldn't figure out what was happening. And she studies health and parasites and even queen health. And they came to find out that there was an ethanol plant in Nebraska, and it was producing pesticide-laden byproducts. And unfortunately, it was corn that had been treated with organophosphate insecticides to control corn rootworm. And so that residue ended up being kind of stored inappropriately, and then also leaching into the groundwater and affecting streams. And they started seeing other insect species that were dying in that area. So anyway, she's been on a real, I want to say, not only research program, but also working on the policy side to help raise awareness. And so those types of practices that in the moment may help a particular cultivar could also have long-lasting effects that are going to ripple out and affect all these other species. I did a project back in 2010, I believe, with a couple of beekeeping families. And I was very amazed that one of the gentlemen had huge white notebooks where you can slip stuff in. And I remember asking him, oh, are those all your, your hive records? And actually he said, no, it's a list of all the pesticides that are used in all the locations where I take my bees. The interesting thing about this project I did with them was that he had actually ended up using a particular product on his bees to help eliminate mites that was off-label, and he ended up making himself sick. So there's a real need for more research on what the sort of longer-term ramifications of pesticide exposure or even herbicide exposure. I mean, herbicides can taint the pollens and the nectars, which then can affect the nutrition. And so a lot of things are happening synergistically that it's not any one single thing, but all the elements come into play: our air quality, our water quality, quality of the soil,
Yeah. And as they say, the devil's in the details.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's no set of policies that will solve all our problems. There's no silver bullet.
Right. But I think pollinators can serve as that gateway insect. We see them, we think of them as fuzzy and buzzy. We think of sweet honey, we think of flowers. And I think that type of sort of picturesque imagining, can also be juxtaposed with a very toxic environment devoid of all these beautiful organisms. Silent Spring, as Rachel
Right.
Carson wrote about. But, my hope is that as sort of an introduction to the world of pollinators, bees can really help to serve as a catalyst to not only show us what the perils are of some of our stewardship choices, but also the hopes of how we can turn things around and how we can actually make better choices, and how everybody can be involved as a community. All ages can plant seeds and grow flowers.
When you work with young people, are they scared of bees at first?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, rightly so, you kind of hear that sound and you're like, and they can sting, and, you don't know what it feels like, but that it probably hurts, Yeah, some people they can have some trepidation on being around bees. And I think it's the more you get to sort of expose yourself to them, it becomes less scary. I've definitely realized that they have their own intentions. They really are quite focused. They're busy bees. They want to go and forage. They have certain roles that they're fulfilling, or they're collecting certain things at certain times because their hive family needs it, or as part of their reproductive cycle. And so I think that once we recognize that they're just trying to live just like we are, and recognize too, like, well, yeah, I want to have a healthy environment. I'm sure they do too. They can get sick. They can have varying pests and diseases that plague them if their immune system is, not strong. And all that is rooted in their nutritional health. And that's, food is medicine for all of us.
We're having this conversation in the dead of winter. It's our New Year's show.
Right.
And I'm looking out the window. The trees are bare. What are the bees doing right now? Are they sleeping?
Good question. Many of them are, they are not hibernating per se, but this is their sort of diapause.
They're what?
Diapause. They're going through their life cycle and they're kind of in a period of rest. For honeybees in particular, they cluster up and they rotate around to not only eat their food stores, but then they actually kind of shiver to generate heat. And so that's part of this nutritional aspect, is they need to have food stores in order to survive through the winter.
So they're eating their own honey?
They're eating their own honeys, yeah. If bees can't put away enough to, survive through a winter, then they sure as heck aren't going to be able to produce extra that we can harvest. There's another way in which we're directly affected, like, oh, no more honey,
Right.
Which is sad. Obviously we found other ways in which to get sweet. We turn beet into sugar, we use agave, or people use all sorts of different types
Sugar
of
cane.
Plants to do that with. Bees, though, are the only ones in particular who they make not only sweetness, but they make medicine, they make light.
They make light?
They make light because of their wax. We can make
right,
candles out of
okay.
it. Yeah. There's just amazing medicines that the bees provide for us.
Do you take any of I've heard people taking bee pollen as medicine.
Yeah. Pollen has a lot of B vitamins. It's good for blood pressure.
No pun intended.
Right. I'm not a medical doctor, but there's a lot of benefits, and there's more research coming out on that. That's, it's a really good protein. I actually do eat royal jelly on occasion, which the bees produce. I eat honey, of course. I make beeswax salves and balms. And pollen, I like eating bee bread, actually, which is the pollen that's packed with honey in the comb. Yeah, there's all sorts of wonderful foods and medicines that the bees provide. And I think that's one of the reasons why honeybees in particular have become so revered throughout the ages and across different cultures, is all this sort of beauty that they bring, not only to landscapes by helping to grow things, but also for health and wellness. The fact that they've become sort of these overexploited poster children of pollinators, like I described, that's more a result of our stewardship practices and our modern stewardship practices. But there is a big movement for a lot of operators, or a lot of beekeepers of varying sizes, from small to large scale, who are looking to really work with farmers and land stewards more for creating more healthy landscapes and foraging zones, not only for their bees, but for all the organisms. The truth about beekeepers, the same with, farmers and ranchers, is they have a love for what they're doing. None of them are doing this to, become billionaires, so to speak, right? Like, there's an interest and a sense of pride in being able to take care of a herd or a flock that is healthy and that is productive, and that for some of these families can produce a revenue of income that sustains their livelihoods, which includes their families and supports their neighbors, right? And helps their community.
What do you most love about your work as a beekeeper or a bee breeder?
Oh man, I really like how dynamic it is, because every season is different. Every place has its own circumstances. Every hive has its own personality. And in that sense, I'm constantly learning, because nothing is ever the same. And so it really kind of encourages me to be a more critical thinker and to be more observant. I run on I don't want to say adrenaline all the time, but I have a very hyperactive mind, and bees really help to put me in the zone, to kind of calm me down. And part of that's, another one of their medicines, sort of frequency medicine. And the whole relationship that's happening between the plants and the pollinators, the perfumes from the plants, which are enticing these pollinators to come. I mean, it's all this chemical communication that's happening, but it's broadcast and reception, right? And I see that happening between the bees and me as well. I mean, that buzz now for me is very soothing. And I know that I'm going to see them where there's flowers, and I love looking at flowers, so they really, I want to say, bring a sense of wellness. And that happens to be, I think, one of my favorite things about being a beekeeper. Seeing how it all connects to the larger world too, and how I want our planet to be well as well. Well as well.
Well, I think that's a good place to send a hope out into the new year.
Yes.
Melanie Kirby, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mary Charlotte. And I really hope that everybody has a happy new year.
And you too.
Thanks.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.